Good morning, everybody. Welcome to CUHK Law. Welcome to this session of the Greater China Legal History Seminar. My name is Lutz Christian Wolf. I'm a professor here at CUHK Law, and I welcome all of you to this interesting seminar on as part of our Greater China Legal History Seminar series. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to mention that the speaker has kindly agreed to join a Q&A session at the end of this seminar. If you have any questions, as always, please use the chat function and chat your question in, and I will read it out on behalf of you at the end of the seminar. As you know, we always have quite interesting discussions after our seminars, and hopefully this will be the same today. Now, we are most honored and very happy to welcome today Professor James St. André. Professor André is professor and head of Department of Translation here at CUHK. He teaches literary translation, translation history, translation theory, and research methodology. He's also the director of the Center for Translation Technology. His recent publications include Conceptualizing China Through Translation, Implications of Computer Co-Translation for Translation Studies, and The Translator as Cultural Ambassador in 2023. But of course, we have invited him today to speak to us because he also works in the legal area. He has worked on the notion of justice in relation to translation, in relation to the topic that he is going to discuss today, and that is Sir George Staunton's 1810 translation of the Qing Penal Code. But he has also worked on court cases from the Song and the Ming, and is therefore looking at legal history from a different perspective. That's, of course, special and important. It's special because we never had any topic in this seminar series relating to translation. So we are very happy to have you with us, James. But it's also important because translations of legal texts, documents, and so on shape the perception of legal systems abroad. And from that point of view, translation is a very important aspect of legal history. That much up front. Thank you, James, for joining us today. And with this, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. So first, I'd like to say thank you to Professor Wolf and Professor Gallagher of the law school here for the invitation to speak to you all today as part of this Greater China Legal History Seminar. Let me share my screen. There. Okay. So I am neither a lawyer nor a legal scholar. So the first thing I'd like to do is to talk a little bit about my bona fides and why it is that I became interested in what is really a fairly recondite subject, this early translation of the Qing Code. So I wrote my, So I wrote my PhD dissertation in comparative literature at the University of Chicago. My chosen topic was crime fiction in Chinese and in English, comparing Sherlock Holmes to Judge Bao, pictured here. And I pursued a structuralist reading of texts to see what they tell us about contemporary society and social values. At that time, Chicago was well known for staff and students being interested in interdisciplinary work. Two of the fields in which I read widely were art history and legal studies. I was interested in art history because the crime fiction that I was researching, both in Chinese and in English, was often illustrated. And so I was interested in how the illustrations added to or changed or challenged the reading experience of the text. And I was interested in law, obviously, because of the subject matter, that it's crime fiction. So while the Sherlock Holmes stories in English are famous for the fact that there is an almost total absence of the justice system in them, with many cases being resolved without anyone being arrested, let alone tried or convicted. The Baogong stories in Chinese feature an historical figure, Judge Bao, who worked as a local magistrate during the Southern Song dynasty. And they are therefore centrally concerned with legal proceedings, even if their fictional representation is in some ways quite different from what we think actually went on in courtrooms in that time period. After finishing my dissertation, I wrote a paper comparing the fictional stories about Judge Bao, which were written in the late Ming dynasties around the year 1600. So comparing those stories from the late Ming with a collection of genuine case materials from the Southern Song dynasty, entitled the Minggong Shupan Qingmingji, or Collection of Enlightened Judgments by Famous Officials, reading them as literary texts and exploring their narrative function. That's not the focus of my talk today, but just to give you a little taste of that paper, one of the most interesting contrasts between them regards the subject matter. So if we look at the fictional cases from the late Ming that feature Magistrate Bao, we see that they're mainly related to sexual misconduct, and that sexual misconduct often results in violence and even murder. If we look here at the illustration on the right, the black and white picture that you see, this is the title page of the collection. So there are 100 stories in it. And there are 5 figures. So there's Judge Bao is in the middle with the black hat facing out. He's flanked on either side by his flunkies and the yamen. But then on the other side of the desk, kneeling in front of him, is a woman and then a monkey. And this story is about a woman who, while her husband is traveling for business, carries on an affair with this monkey in the household. And then the two of them are eventually caught and executed. So that's the illustration that the compiler of this edition chose for the title page of this collection, and that really foregrounds the extent to which sex, violence, and well, even bestiality are perceived as being, like what the collection is about. Whereas if we look at the historical collection of cases from the Southern dynasty, the Southern Song dynasty, these are mainly about property. And when sexual misconduct is mentioned, the allegations that are made are often rejected by the judge or ignored, and accusations of violence frequently turn out to be false. The other interesting thing about this collection is that in the fictional cases, most of the magistrates, with the exception of Judge Bao, are portrayed as incompetent, corrupt, or both, often applying torture to extract false confessions from people because they are bribed. While the enlightened judgments from the Song dynasty feature honest local magistrates working zealously to keep the peace, often by discouraging commoners from filing lawsuits in the first place. So overall, we can say that the enlightened judgment portrays a legal system that works fairly well to administer justice, while the magistrate Bao stories portray a broken system in which only the intervention of an almost supernaturally heroic figure, Judge Bao, can restore justice to the common people. So that's sort of one area that I explored, this looking at real historical cases, comparing them to fictional cases, trying to get at what is going on in terms of the portrayal of justice and what that tells us about the authors and the readers of these materials. But then I accepted a postdoctoral fellowship in Taiwan after I finished my PhD, and I was working on translation history, specifically early translations from Chinese into English. And I was amazed to find that one of the earliest works translated directly from Chinese into English was the Great Qing Code, the Da Qing Lu Li, which Staunton published in 1810. I also discovered that there was a copy of that 1810 translation sitting in the library at Academia Sinica, where I was doing my research. And since it fit in with my interest in law and literature, I decided that I should look at this more closely. So I did a close reading of the entire text. So I read the entire translation of the code and the extensive paratextual material that I'll be talking about today, to try to get a sense of what was going on with this text. Because for me, let's move on to this translation seems to be an anomaly. How did somebody like Sir George Staunton, who has no legal background, as far as I could determine, wind up translating this kind of a text, right? What did he hope to accomplish, and was he successful? Oh, I'm sorry, keep getting there. So here we have Sir George Thomas Staunton. This is him in sort of early middle age. He's in his probably early 40s at this point. Um, so Staunton's translation for me combines sort of three things that are sort of interesting. One, the relationship between fiction and law. Two, the relationship between the translation history between Chinese and English. And three, my interest in how justice is portrayed in a narrative text. So Staunton, getting to the question of sort of why Staunton and why he does this, I would say that he was the right man in the right place at the right time. So in 1792, at the age of 12, George Thomas Staunton accompanied his father, George Leonard Staunton, uh, as part of Lord Macartney's retinue on his mission to China, the first British mission to China. We're looking at two paintings of him. The one on the left shows him before he leaves for China. So he's 11 or 12 years old. He's standing there and he's pointing on the globe. You can't really see it here because it's not large enough, but if you enlarge the image, you realize that he's pointing to China. That's why his hand is like that. So this is after he knows that he's going to China. His father commissioned this portrait of him to be made, and the portraitist decided that this would be that the fact that he's traveling to China is something that they wanted to foreground. The image on the right is him after he comes back from the trip. So this would be a couple of years later because the trip was quite long. And there are three figures. So there's his mother, who, in a sense, we could say it looks like she may be greeting him on his return. Then there's Staunton himself. And then there's this kind of dark figure of a Chinese person behind Staunton. So maybe sort of following him, having come back with him from his trip. The objects that are associated with all three figures in this image are emblematic. So the Chinese person is shown holding a box of tea. So that's a tea caddy that he has in his hand, which, of course, by this time had become the main Chinese export to Britain, and thus the main cause of the trade imbalance between the two countries. Note that the young Staunton, who has voyaged to China and who will eventually join the East India Company, be stationed in Guangzhou, and eventually become the head of the company there, is empty-handed. So the Chinese person is bringing tea, but Staunton has nothing to offer in return. And this neatly encapsulates the problem that the British faced at the end of the 18th century, that they wanted to buy lots of things from China, especially tea, but they had very little that they could sell back. And then finally, if we look at the figure of his mother, we see that she's holding a letter in her hand, and that there are letters and writing implements on the table next to her. This is emblematic of the fact that, of course, at this time, the way that people kept in touch, especially when they were separated by such great distances, was through letters. So that presumably is a letter maybe that she had received from him, or she was preparing to write for him before his return. The Staunton papers that are held at Duke University in North Carolina are made up mainly of letters that Staunton wrote to his mother. And so Staunton and his mother carried on a correspondence for all the time that they were separated. And he spent quite a lot of time abroad. We only have the letters that Staunton wrote to his mother. The letters that she wrote to him have all disappeared, presumably because they reached him in various places, and he probably didn't think that they were valuable enough to keep. Whereas his mother kept them at the family estate, his letters to her at the family estate. So besides letters that he wrote to his mother, we also have notebooks that he wrote. And so this is the first page of one of his journals here. So in anticipation of his travels to China with his father procured for him a Chinese tutor. And the tutor began teaching him Chinese while he was in England, and then accompanied him on the journey to China on the boat and continued to teach him on the ship. The voyage from England to China took almost 8 months. So they left from England, they sailed down toward the coast of Africa, they got blown across the Atlantic, they went to South America, they stopped there, they had a long visit in South America, then they went back across the ocean, past the Cape of Good Hope, across the Indian Ocean, up through the Indonesian archipelago, stopped in Singapore, and then finally arrived in Guangzhou. And all that time that he was on the boat, Staunton was practicing Chinese with his tutor. So here, if we look at the title page, Journal of a Voyage to China, you see that next to it we have then the title, the same thing in Chinese, 小书论路从英吉利国到中国, right? So that's the Chinese translation. So we see Staunton already trying his hand at translation, working between the two languages. And on the facing page, we see his name written in Chinese characters, Staunton. Those are the large characters kind of a little bit to the left. And then 4 smaller characters next to them are the name of Macartney, who of course was in charge of the mission, Majara No, in modern Mandarin. Then he's got a few other things there. It's quite amusing. He's writing the numbers. He goes 1, 2, 3, 4, and then he does 7, 9, 10, 6, 5, 11, 20. So not quite sure why he's putting them in that order. But anyway, so we see him that he's on the ship, he's practicing his Chinese. When he on the mission, he was appointed as a page to Lord Macartney. And by the time that they arrived in China and then voyaged overland to Beijing, his Chinese was good enough that he actually had a brief exchange with the Qianlong Emperor in Chinese, who then presented him with a gift personally and praised his Chinese. And so because of this role that he played as a page in the embassy, he is well represented in images of that event. So this is a watercolor painting made by William Alexander, who was a member of the expedition. He was a draftsman. You can't quite see Staunton in this because I'm sorry, it's been cut off on the right-hand side. But you see in the center is the Qianlong Emperor on being carried on a chair, and he's got this enormous retinue of people. The Emperor is obviously sort of front and center and is in motion. Whereas then way down in the corner, we have a few British people standing stationary, right? So they're standing and waiting, and the emperor is moving towards him. So there they are. Here's a blow above it. So this is the figure in the middle with the tall white hat is Lord Macartney. And then Sir George Staunton Sr. is next to him in a black hat. And then we see that the son, George Thomas Staunton, is standing behind Lord Macartney in a red coat, holding Macartney's train as his page. There's another image of him. This is another piece that was published elsewhere, where we see that again in the middle. Well, on the left we have the emperor seated, and then kind of in the middle, just to the right, is Lord Macartney, who is kneeling on one knee to present his petition from his monarch to the emperor, and then Sir George Staunton is standing in a black hat and with his arm around his son, who is then next to him. So there's lots of images of him, and obviously the trip to China made an enormous impression upon uh, the son. Um, so they return back to England. After he gets back to England, Staunton continues his studies of Chinese because his father, who was involved in the East India Company, had already decided that his son should go into the business, follow in his father's footsteps. And his father decided that if he knew Chinese, that he would be in an excellent position to work in the branch of the East India Company that was concerned with the China trade. And indeed, eventually Staunton becomes the head of that branch. So the young Staunton enters the East India Company in 1798 at the age of 18, and he is appointed naturally to go to China. An example of his proficiency in Chinese, an early example, is this text here. So this is a text in Chinese that Staunton wrote, or rather, I should say, translated. So this is a text talking about vaccination. So vaccination obviously was something in the late 18th, early 19th century that William Jenner is championing in England. There's a physician who is stationed in Guangzhou, Alexander Pearson, who writes a short tract about how to inoculate people against smallpox. And Staunton then takes this text and translates it into Chinese. And so here we see this isn't the title page, this is the illustration. You see the image of an arm with a spot on it showing so you do the vaccination on the arm here, and then there's two illustrations of different types of instruments that can be used to perform the inoculation. One is an ivory needle, and the other one is kind of a short surgical knife. So Staunton, by 1805, is already quite proficient in Chinese, proficient enough to actually write a text in the language and get it published. And then the final thing that decides him to do the translation is an event that happens in 1807. So in 1807, Staunton's in Guangzhou working for the East India Company, and there's a homicide case which involves British subjects getting into a fight with some Chinese, and a Chinese person winds up being killed. So the local Chinese magistrate wants to investigate. They arrest a man named Edward Sheen for the murder, and they want to try him. So eventually, several people, including the local officials, colluded in perjury, claiming that Sheen had accidentally dropped a stick from a high window in the British factory and thus inadvertently killed the passerby. And then the officials say that after investigation, he was fined and then paid the fine, and so therefore was released. This result, the fact that he was let off with a fine, differed from similar cases both before and after him. So the most famous case, similar case to this, is the Lady Hughes affair. Lady Hughes was a ship. While it was in the harbor in Guangzhou, the gunner of the ship fired a salute to a passing ship, which he wasn't supposed to do because China had said, don't shoot guns in the harbor because it's dangerous. And indeed, a shot from the gun then landed on somebody and killed them. In that case, the sailor was arrested, brought to a Chinese court, tried, convicted, and executed. And at the time, the British were quite upset because the way that the British portrayed the event was that it was an accident, and therefore, as an accident, it couldn't be ruled as a homicide. It should have been adjudicated as an accidental death, and then the punishment was too heavy. So for them, this was an unjust solution to the case. So there's a similar case in 1821 involving an American ship this time, where a group of sailors on shore leave got drunk, got into a fight, and wound up killing somebody. Eventually, and again, the Chinese demanded that the responsible person be handed over for trial. Eventually, the American gave them an Italian seaman named Terranova and said, okay, this is the guy who did it. And again, the Chinese tried and then executed him. The Sheen affair is a little bit different because of the way that the trial played out. So what happened was the court case was tried by Chinese officials, but the trial took place within the British factory. So on sort of, British land. Well, not really, but an area that the British were controlled at that time. And there were soldiers and British seamen present at the trial, right? So sort of guarding the area. And when it became clear, and Staunton was also present, so Staunton is in the room while this is happening. But another person who was present was Captain Rolls. So Captain Rolls was the captain of the ship on which Sheen was a sailor. And as Rolls watched the proceedings unfold, Rolls became dissatisfied with the proceedings and said, I don't think this is fair. I don't think this is just. And Rolls refused to let the Chinese judges take Sheen away to be then executed. And instead he said, no, I'm not going to let you do this to this man. I'm taking him back to my ship. So then there's a sort of a stalemate where eventually they reach this compromise, which is that the Chinese changed the details of the case so that according to the Chinese legal system, they can argue that the man can be let off with a fine. So with different legal systems, according to the circumstances, a case where somebody dies can be accidental death, it can be homicide, it can be first degree, second degree, and so on and so forth. So according to the British system, if somebody is killed in an affray, then that can't be ruled as an accident. But instead, they concocted this story about him dropping a stick accidentally out of the window, and then the stick accidentally hitting a person on the head below him and accidentally killing him. And that's how they get around this impasse. So this case in 1807 obviously spurred Staunton's interest in the Chinese legal system, because Staunton and the other members of the East India Company realized that they knew actually very little about how the Chinese law worked. And therefore, they didn't really understand these distinctions that the Chinese were trying to make in the case in order to come to the decision that they came to. And so 3 years later, Staunton publishes his translation of the Qing Penal Code. So Staunton's translation is, oh no, I'll get there in a minute. So Staunton's translation is the only one until the only complete translation of the text until the late 20th century, when a scholar in the US publishes one in 1994. But then, therefore, for anybody who is interested in the Chinese legal system who doesn't know Chinese, Staunton's translation of the Qing Code is the go-to text. So this is the one that everybody looks at. And in fact, if we check library catalogs today, 54 libraries in the United States have copies of the 1810 edition of Staunton's translation. There were also translations of the English translation into French, Italian, and Spanish. And again, those are works that are easily found in libraries in different countries. Sir John Francis Davis, who of course was the governor of Hong Kong from 1844 to 1848, is quoted as saying that a copy of Da Qing Lu Li, that's the title of the text in English, always lay before the judge when Chinese were concerned. So he's saying that Staunton's translation of the Qing Code was used in the Hong Kong courts if a case involved a Chinese litigant of some kind. A reprint of it was published as late as 1966. So it's an important text. It's widely read. It was used, although Staunton didn't do the translation having in mind that it would be used in a legal setting, right? So in 1808, 1809, 1810, Hong Kong is not a British colony and doesn't become a British colony till decades later. So he is producing his translation as a source of information, not as a legal instrument. So this then gets to sort of how I approach or how I read this case or this document. So my approach is to read it as an argument. So in other words, I'm saying the attitude of the translator toward the material that he or she translates influences translation practice at all levels, from the choice of individual words to the conception of the translation as a whole in its presentation to an audience. It should then be possible to learn something of the motivation of a translator through a close examination of his or her translation and the choices that they make. Further, by examining evidence of how the translation was received, it should be possible to say something about the success of the translator in achieving her or his aims. And then for me, also, I want to emphasize that when I talk about the translation here and in following discussion, what I mean is not just the text of the translation itself of the code, but also the footnotes, the appendices, the introduction, the tables, and so forth. These materials have been labeled paratext by the French literary scholar Gerard Genette, who provides theoretical justification for treating these extraneous materials as an integral part of the unit that makes up the meaning of the text. And again, I must stress that this is not a legal translation. It is not one prepared for use in a court of law, but rather is a reference work for foreigners to try to understand, especially people in the East India Company. So here we have the title page. So the title page on the right is the English title page of the text, and on the left we have not the title page of the Chinese edition, but a facsimile of the title page of the Chinese edition, which is included as part of the translation. So this, when you open up the book, this is the first thing you see. You see the Chinese facsimile on the left and the English title page on the right. So underneath the facsimile says facsimile of the title page of the latest edition of the Daxing Li, published in the 1805, the 10th of the reigning Emperor Jia. So he's emphasized the word facsimile here. A facsimile of a text is not just reproducing the text, but reproducing the manner of the text, right? So the font, the size of the letterings, the arrangement on the page, the type of paper, everything, right? So a facsimile is as exact a copy as you can get. So the implication, of course, is that Staunton's translation is going to be as exact a copy of the text as possible. Then we move to the English. Daxing Li, sorry, gets cut off at the top, being the fundamental laws in a selection, in very small print, selection from the supplementary statutes of the Penal Code of China, originally printed and published in Peking in various successive editions, under the sanction and by the authority of the several emperors of the Daxing or present dynasty. Translated from the Chinese and accompanied with an appendix consisting of authentic documents and a few occasional notes illustrative of the subject of the work by Sir George Thomas Staunton, Baronet, Fellow of the Royal Society. He was actually a founding member of it. And then there's a quotation in Latin from Cicero, which I've consulted the Loeb Classic Library because I don't read Latin. So the Loeb's rendition of it is, within the law are repose the mind and heart, the judgment and the conviction of the state. So this is a very strong statement of how important legal texts are and how much we can know about a people by studying their legal system. So, in summary, the title page states that his translation is based on an authoritative and up-to-date version of the code. His translation is a facsimile of the Chinese. It is so close that you can't tell the difference. Staunton, is eminently qualified. The translation will reveal the mind and heart, the judgment and the conviction of the Chinese. And present on the title page, but not really emphasized, he admits that there has been some editing and that he has added his own opinion and ideas. Those few supplementary notes, which we will see later, are actually quite numerous. Then if we turn to the a consideration of sort of like what are the parts of the book that we're looking at. We have the Chinese title page, the English title page, a dedication, which is just a page. Then the translator's preface is quite extensive, 35 pages. Table of contents is 25 pages because he gives a detailed overviews of the contents, not just individual chapters, but he breaks them down. Then there are translations of 3 different imperial prefaces to the code, a title page of an early edition of the text, which we learn he also consulted. So he looked at not one but 2 different editions of the text, and in this case, the title page he gives a translation. And then we have 6 pages of tables, followed finally by the translation itself, which, as you can see, 474 pages, quite substantial. And then an appendix, which contains 30 different items, which runs 96 pages. So all of this is to say that the total paratextual material, so the material that surrounds the translation itself, is about a quarter of the entire book. So Staunton is doing quite a lot of work around the translation, which he also puts a lot of work into, to frame that translation and to interpret that translation. So what I'm going to do for most of the remaining time is I'm going to be talking about the paratext, so about all of this supplementary material around the text to try to see what Staunton is trying to do, what he's trying to argue. And then I will talk briefly about the translation itself and then make a couple of concluding remarks. So in the introduction, which I said is quite substantial, I pull out a few points that I think are most important. The first one is he, following up on the quotation from Cicero that he has on the title page, he stresses that the best way to understand China is to understand her laws. So then, therefore, obviously, we need to have a translation and we need to read it and understand it. He stresses the fidelity of the translation to the original text and talks about having captured the full meaning of the original. And as part of that, he argues, and I think if you are legal scholars, you might be a little bit amused by this. He says, partly because the legal text is written in such a simple style and such a simple language that it is very easy to understand. And in the few places where he has problems understanding, there are copious annotations. So he said that he has no problem understanding the original text, which I personally find quite funny. Anyway, then he has a long section where he talks about different attitudes toward the Chinese, which in the late 18th, early 19th century, we could really divide them into 2 camps. We have the Catholic missionaries and their followers who had already been, at this point, had been in China for centuries and generally tended to paint quite a rosy picture of the Chinese. On the other hand, we have what I call the China bashing British, and especially, quite interestingly, some of the members of the McCartney mission to China that Staunton was on, after they returned to the UK, wrote descriptions of it and said a lot of very negative things about the Chinese and China. So, in particular, James Barrow wrote Travels in China, 1806, where he really rails against, I mean, he really dislikes the Chinese. And he has very little positive things to say about them. And every time he gets a chance, he will cut them down. Um, so Staunton kind of says, okay, we have the Jesuits who are really positive, and then we have these other people who have really negative views of the Chinese. And then Staunton says, but I am in the middle. I try to be impartial. I am trying to be neutral. I see that there are good things. I see that there are bad things. Okay, so he's this idea of neutrality in the translator, um, which again would mean that his translation would be accurate and faithful and give us a good idea of what the Chinese are really like, because he's not trying to either vilify them or or put them on a pedestal. He also stresses many positive aspects of the code and downplays negative ones in the introduction, which kind of contradicts what he says about himself being neutral. And then he specifically engages with James Barrow's work and rebuts some of the charges that Barrow makes. So Barrow, for example, says that female infanticide is widespread in China at the time, and that local magistrates routinely use torture in deciding court cases. And Staunton said this just isn't true. Um, so that's the introduction. Um, in the Imperial Preface, sorry, they said he translates three Imperial Prefaces. Staunton manages to work in the word just or justice in all three of them. And I've given you two examples here. Um, so the first case, thus shall the magistrates and people look up with awe and submission to the justice of these institutions. Justice of these institutions as a translation for Mingi is a real stretch. And then in the second case, um, 义务非小 must constantly be liable to commit great errors. So that's not a bad translation of the Chinese, and even flagrant injustice. So here, that and even flagrant injustice is an interpolation on Staunton's part. And even though it's the word injustice rather than justice, what the emperor is saying in his preface is that these kinds of things, these sorts of flagrant injustices, are what we must avoid. Um, so he works the word justice, injustice into the imperial prefaces to make the argument then that the emperors were concerned with what is just. Then we get to something which is a little bit weird. So the Qing code at the beginning, there's some prefatory material before the main actual statutes. There's three sections. One of them is some tables. So these tables give information about punishments and the severity of punishments depending on things like degree of mourning. So like if a son were to strike his father, that would be punished much more heavily than if a father were to strike his son, right? Because of the uh, I want to say unequal, because of the hierarchical nature of the Chinese family system. So these tables lay out sort of information about how do you make adjustments to punishments according to these kinds of things. And also, there are certain types of crimes where the punishments can be commuted to a fine, and then they lay out, like, okay, so if the punishment is 50 strokes of the cane, then you can pay X amount of money and instead, and then you don't have to you don't have to be beaten. So these two of the tables are portrayed here. One of them is 4 pages long, which is sorry, I tried to cram it in here. It's a little bit small. And the other one is 1 page long. So these two tables then are transformed by Staunton into this scale of pecuniary redemption of necessarily redeemable punishments. So that's just a long way of saying in cases where the plaintiff can is allowed to redeem the punishment by paying a fine, this is the amount that they're going to be charged. So Staunton is doing quite a lot of work here in this translation. So in other words, oops, sorry, there it is. So the easy thing to do would be to copy the format of the Chinese table and then just to translate inside each box what the Chinese text says, right? And then you're done. But instead, Staunton spent a long time rearranging the information, simplifying the information, combining the two tables together and streamlining it so that it looks to a British audience like a British table. And as my example of a British table, I've given this one from the Asiatic Journal from 1820, so it's a little bit later than Staunton. But you see the idea that you have these columns and rows, and the way that the columns and rows are formatted is the same. That you have the black lines eliminating only the headers, and then down further the individual rows you don't have any kind of lines between them. The use of a long line or a dash instead of a zero in places where there's no number, things like that. So all of those things are being used by Staunton in his table. So he does a lot of things. He switches the rows and the columns. Columns becomes rows, rows become columns. He reduces the amount of text. He omits quite a lot of information, actually, in this case. So, for example, in the Chinese, we learned that for many of the punishments, you can either pay a certain fixed amount of silver, or you can pay a certain fixed amount of unhulled rice, or you can pay a certain fixed amount of hulled rice. And Staunton completely gets rid of the information about the rice. So in the English table, it's all about money, right? It's all been converted to silver and nothing else. Also, there's information in the original table for things like the fine for involuntary homicide is to be given to the family of the deceased to help defray funeral expenses rather than being given to the government. So in most cases, the fine, if it's paid, is paid into the coffers of the local government. But for certain crimes, the money is supposed to be paid to the affected party, and Staunton omits that information. And then he also changes the order of some of the information. So he's doing a lot of work here to what I would say is domesticate the translation. So in translation studies, we tend to say that a translation can be either domesticating or foreignizing. So a domesticating translation is a translation that tries to make the translation look like a text written in the target language. So Staunton is trying to make his table look like a British table, not like a Chinese table. And we'll also see that he does the same thing in his translation. And again, I just want to stress that this is extra work that he takes to do this. It's not the easy thing to do. It's actually the hard thing to do. Then when we look at the table of contents, there's a couple of interesting things going on here. So first of all, what he has 7 divisions, first, second, third, fourth. So the first division that he lists is actually not a section of the main part of the code at all. It's part of the introductory material. But Staunton makes this into a section on its own and gives it a title, General Laws, where really it's about certain basic regulations and things like that. Again and again, like the tables, is part of the supplementary material at the beginning. And then for the remaining 6 divisions, those 6 divisions correspond to the 6 branches of government under the Qing. Okay, so the way that the government works in the Qing dynasty is really fundamentally different from the type of structure that we have in either in the UK or in the United States. So like I'm an American, I'm more from the United States. You have 3 branches of government, and then there's all about the interrelationship between the 3 branches of government. But in China, you have 6. And the way that he names the 6, especially what he calls the second division and the third division, is very interesting. So the second division, which is really the first part of the main one, the Li Lu, is really laws that govern officials. So anything concerning the conduct of an official is covered in this section. But somehow he decides that he's going to call this civil law. Honestly, I don't understand how it gets there. But the interesting thing about it is that this allows him to have a section on civil law and a section on, as we look down, number 6, criminal law. And I hope that civil law and criminal law will sound very familiar to most of this audience, because of course this is a distinction that is made in European and specifically British law. And it is something that is being discussed at this time period, as I will talk about later. So he makes some really, in a sense, substantial changes to this, although, again, if you don't know the Chinese, you wouldn't have any idea about this. Then if we turn to the footnotes, so as I mentioned, so the title page says, oh, he's got a few footnotes. But actually, when we look at the footnotes, first of all, we discovered that some of them are quite substantial, and there are quite a lot of them. And I've divided them into sort of a few categories. So you have the kind of, C section 23 for a comparison or something like that. And you have short ones that are kind of, explaining some detail of the text or something like that, right? But then you also have footnotes that are what I would say argumentative. So they're footnotes that are trying to make a point about something. So, for example, section 173, honorary attendance on superiors in rank. So this section talks about if a junior official in a post is being visited by a senior official, there are rules about how they should be greeted. And one of the rules is that you should never go beyond the city walls to greet a visiting official. So if you do that, then you get punished. So for Staunton, and probably Staunton is thinking for his readers, this sounds a little bit strange, that there should be a rule like this. Like, who cares? Why would you be interested in regulating such a thing? So he has a footnote. In respect to this law and others of the same description, it may be remarked that however degrading and oppressive they may appear in the eyes of a European, they are in China intimately connected with, and indeed no more than the natural consequence of the peculiar character and genius of the people. Here, where he uses the word peculiar, I would say that in the 21st century, we would today say particular. So it's not peculiar in the sense of strange, it's peculiar in the sense of particular to that person or character. So he sort of is going out of his way to excuse the fact that there's a difference, or to explain the fact that the reason that this law appears strange to us is because the Chinese have a different social structure, and so therefore they need a law like this. So this law is apt and just and necessary in a Chinese code, even if it wouldn't be necessary in a British one. He's also got some footnotes where he compares between um, Chinese and European, specifically British law. So, for example, Section 22, indulgence to offenders in consideration of age, youth, or infirmities. He has a footnote about this where he says he draws attention to the fact that, of course, in European and specifically in British law, we also have these kinds of adjustments that we make. Right? So if a person is a minor, then they get treated differently, and the punishment may be less, and so on and so forth. And then in section 336, false and malicious informations. Staunton has a note where he says that there is no oath taking in the Chinese legal system. So, people don't swear on a Bible before they give evidence and things like that. But he says they do have a sense of perjury, and it is this section 336, false and malicious information, that details the or that deals with the problem of people who perjure themselves in the court. So on the one hand, sometimes he is excusing certain things in the law by saying that Chinese society is different. Other times he is saying, "Oh, look, the Chinese are just like us, right? Are they make um, exceptions for youths, and they have a sense of perjury and so on and so forth." Right, so these comparative ones. Oop. And he also has quite a few footnotes where he praises the Chinese system. So, for example, in section 52, he praises the Chinese civil service examination system because it's open to all. This is something actually that I did some research on later, and it's quite interesting. In the late 18th, early 19th century, most government posts in the UK were awarded on the basis of patronage. Right? So there is no civil service examination in the UK before the 1860s. Um, and the UK modern civil service system, as we know it, actually comes out of an examination into the Chinese civil service examination, and then a decision that they want to try to do something similar. And Staunton is picking up on that here quite early in the 19th century. Another section talks about the fact that since the Chinese have an extensive kinship network, this means that the legal system doesn't really need to be involved with relief because somebody in your family will always take care of you. You always have a relative that you can turn to for help. And so the state doesn't have to step in. Section 91, he praises the use of tax remission as a disaster relief. So in China, if there's a flood or something like that, often the government would say, okay, this year, the province of Hubei doesn't have to pay taxes because you don't have any money, because you don't have any food. And even would often provide grain. And then in another section, he praises the power of the censors as a check on the absolute power of the monarch. This is also, again, of particular interest if we think about the fact that in 1800, so he's doing this translation between 1807 and 1810. In that time period, who was on the throne in the UK? It's George III, the Mad King, who in 1811, a year after this translation is published, is basically placed under, restraint, and his son takes over as George IV, the regent. Well, he takes over as regent, and then after his father passes away, he becomes George IV. So this question about the power of the monarch would have been very topical for anybody in England at this time period. And Staunton makes a point of saying that the censor system in China is one of the ways in which the power of the monarch is held in check. And then, so that's pretty much all I have to say about the footnotes. Then we get to the appendices. So again, there are 30 appendices, almost 100 pages. So if the introduction and the title page and the translation itself sort of are presenting the law, presenting the legal code, and arguing about what the legal code is, the appendices are trying to show how that law is then put into action. So not just, okay, they have a code, but they actually use it. So in Appendix 30, Staunton gives a case of a man tried for homicide with a gun. And in that case then shows how the review process works in the Chinese legal system. So it shows that the case was reviewed by a higher court and then passed on to a higher court and then eventually gets to the emperor, who then, puts a little red circle next to it or whatever, and then the person either gets executed or doesn't. In Appendix 8 through 10, he gives details of trials of offenses committed by government officials. So again, this is emphasizing the fact that no one is above the law, right? That even if you're a government official, if you do something wrong, you're going to be in trouble. Appendix 31 is the trial of a master for killing a servant. In this case, at the local level, there's a miscarriage of justice because the judge accepts a bribe. And then, but when the case is carried to a higher level on appeal, the affair is sorted out. And in addition, the lower level official who initially passed the erroneous judgment because of the bribe is punished. So again, we're seeing that the law is not only just in and of itself, but the way that the law is employed, the way that the law is put into action is also working. And then we get back to Edward Sheen. So obviously, as I said, this was the Sheen case was the immediate motivation for Staunton to do the translation in the first place. So of course, in the appendices, he has a long, detailed discussion of the case. And at the end of that discussion of the case, Staunton says, although the falsehood in which so many persons concurred was, no doubt, base and criminal in itself, it neither produced nor was intended to produce the slightest deviation from substantial justice in respect to the person accused. They, the officers of the government, therefore, under those difficult circumstances, i.e., the British, the British holding a gun to their head and saying, "We're not letting you take this guy," under these difficult circumstances, contrived to do that which was just in itself, though they certainly resorted to means which were far from defensible. But even though he says the means were far from defensible, Staunton is defending them. So that's his conclusion about the Sheen case. Wait, I'm sorry, I forgot to advance the slide. There's the quotation. So substantial justice and justice. So again, he's got the words justice and just both, in this quotation. So I've talked about all of the paratextual material. So now let me talk briefly about the translation. So I'm not talking about the translation too much because quite a lot of the details I think would be probably a little bit boring for you. But here on this slide, actually, let me just talk about the third one here, covering up cultural differences. So again, as I mentioned earlier, a domesticating translation is one that tries to make the text read like a text in the target language, not like a text from the original culture. So we can see an example of this here in the translation of the Chinese phrase "qi xie ou fu." So qi and qie are two different types of legally distinct women. Qi is the first wife, and qie are concubines or second wives or subsequent wives, secondary wives. And Staunton translates it simply as wives striking their husband. So the topic of polygamy in China is one of those flashpoints in the British discourse concerning the Chinese and Chinese society. So I'd say concubinage, so the fact that they have multiple wives, polygamy, bound feet is another one. Wearing a queue, so the hairstyle, the bianzi, is another one of them. So there are certain issues that are real sort of focal points of discussion and debate about what is the difference between China and Europe. Are the Chinese good people or bad people, so on and so forth, right? So a lot of these focus on women. So like I say, bound feet and polygamy. So the fact that Staunton here conceals the fact that the Chinese text is talking about two categories of women who have different legal status, and in the European's eyes, this is a totally wrong thing to be, right? That you're only supposed to have one wife, one wife, one husband, that's it, right? So he's doing this kind of thing constantly in the translation, that he's making these choices of how to phrase things, when to, maybe elide information, when to group things together that in the original are separate, or when to list out different things when maybe in the Chinese they're one thing, and so forth. This is going on every page of the translation. And then I want to give you another example of what, ooh, that's a little bit blurry. Sorry, I guess it's blown up too much. So this is, sorry, I don't have the citation for this. So this is just, this is a chunk of text from the Chinese. So in my analysis, I pulled out a few paragraphs of the Chinese text and then look at the translation. So here, what you're looking at is two sentences, basically from the one section of the code, where the large characters are the main text, the actual text of the code, and the small characters are commentary. Okay, so Chinese texts, anything from editions of the classics to imperial history to whatever official history, all sorts of texts were published that had any kind of commentary were published in this fashion, that you have the main text and the commentary are mixed together on the page. But you can always tell the difference because they're printed in different size, right? So, and actually in the original Chinese, the smaller characters that are here, I've got it in a modern format, horizontally, but normally there would be, it would be the main text would be vertical, big characters, and then the small characters, which are the commentary, would be in a double column underneath them. So the characters would be half size, and so you could fit twice as many characters, right? So you get this kind of mashing together of the original and the commentary throughout all sorts of Chinese texts, and it's just the normal way that you read them. So Staunton, and it's very clear to a Chinese reader here what is the original text and what is the commentary, right? Like, so there's no confusion in a Chinese person's mind about, the big characters are the main text and the small characters are supplementary. Staunton takes this material and he turns it into this. So basically, he completely eliminates the distinction between the text of the code and the commentaries. So here, the material that is underlined is material that comes from the commentary. And then material in bold is material that he's added. Okay. So again, every page, every paragraph, Staunton is doing this with his translation. He's melding together his translation of the code with his translation of selections from the commentaries and producing a single uniform text and frequently adding things to it. So this is the facsimile, faithful reproduction of the translation that Staunton is talking about on the title page, which is this. One of the things that one whole branch of translation studies is looking at the difference between what translators say they're going to do in their prefaces and what they actually do in their translations. And Staunton is an excellent example of this because his introduction, makes all these claims about fidelity and so on and so forth, and then he does this kind of thing consistently throughout the text. So I'm almost out of time. So I want to just make a couple of points to kind of locate Staunton's translation in his time period and in kind of debates about what's happening in terms of legal developments in England and Europe, which of course is where the text is being one of the places where the text is being read. So one interesting thing I discovered is that Staunton is basically a Benthamite. So Jeremy Bentham is a contemporary of Staunton, and before and after Staunton publishes his translation, Bentham writes a series of reviews of legal matters in the Edinburgh Review, and it's mainly the Edinburgh Review, where he lays out in the process of reviewing these various works, he lays out his opinions regarding law and what law should be. So Bentham in these reviews clearly favors a code as a system rather than the British system of precedent. Bentham is very, very in favor of using things like tables and trying to make the code as systematic and regular as possible. Bentham also stresses the need for the code to be revised and updated regularly. Again, we saw on the title page that Staunton talked about the fact that the Qing government had frequently updated and revised the code, right? So he's ticked that box. Bentham also was not a fan of judges having discretion in terms of passing sentence. So once a person was found guilty, then Bentham felt that the punishment should be relatively fixed, right? So that the judge shouldn't have a lot of discretion. And Staunton's translation of the Qing Code shows that the Chinese system is similar to that. And finally, Bentham is one of the people who, in this time period, is discussing what exactly is the difference between civil and criminal code, civil and criminal law. How do we distinguish them? Why do we distinguish them, and so forth. So that's one of his main topics. And as I've said, we've seen that Staunton in the table of contents manages to get civil code, criminal code in there, right? So he's got this distinction that he's sticking there. So Staunton, insofar as we can identify his ideas or his thoughts about law, seems to have taken quite a lot from Bentham. And again, as I said, he doesn't have any legal training, but these reviews that I'm talking about that Bentham published are being published in popular, well, popular / learned reviews of the day that somebody like Staunton would be quite likely to read, because Staunton actually himself also publishes in them at a later date. Excuse me. So, in summary, we can say, if we look at Staunton's translation, the Chinese legal code for him is logically organized, well-reasoned, universal in scope, non-contradictory, adapted for Chinese culture, changing over time to meet the needs of a changing society, and esteemed and honored by the population because it is just. When the code is put into action, it is efficaciously applied in Chinese society. Decisions are reached through precedent as well as the application of the code. The code is applied to people of all ranks, and the code produces just solutions to real problems. And therefore, we can say in terms of justice, the Chinese people are no better or worse than the British. The Chinese use the same modes of reasoning as the British. They have a sense of justice, and the sense of justice is not bound by the letter of the law. When necessary, they are able to transcend or bend the law to a higher order. And this is essentially what Staunton argues in the Edward Sheen case. So that all sounds great, right? I finished my reading of the text and look at what a masterful job Staunton has done, and now we're all his readers are going to be convinced that the Chinese have this great justice system. It doesn't work that way in real life. So I looked at reviews of Staunton's translation. So I mean, it's a big deal when it gets published, and all of the major reviews publish reviews of it. Every single review goes out of its way to praise his translation for being faithful and complete. Nobody has a word to say about any of those changes that I mentioned in the text, probably because there isn't anybody in England at this time that would know enough Chinese to be able to compare the original to the translation. So they all accept his argument. They are completely convinced that this is a facsimile edition of the Qing Code. But they completely disagree with his interpretation that is presented in the footnotes, the appendices, and the introduction. And I just give as an example here their views of the Edward Sheen case. So Staunton again goes out of his way to say, the quarterly review has this long. I have this long. We cannot subscribe to the apology offered for the Canton government by Sir George Staunton. Their sole object was evidently directed to the bribe of £50,000, and for this alone, there can be little doubt the string of lies was invented. The subsequent promulgation of such impudent falsehoods in the face of thousands who had in their power to contradict them affords an additional proof of the corruption and profligacy of the Chinese government. And the Edinburgh Review, summing up their discussion of the Sheen case, say, bribery on an enormous scale excuses anything in China. So swings and roundabout, right? So that he makes his pitch, but in the end, that pitch is, even though they accept the accuracy of the translation, they reject his interpretation. And again, so for somebody in translation studies, it's very interesting the relationship between the understanding of the text and the interpretation of the text. And traditionally, translators are admonished to stick to um, delivering the facsimile, the what is actually there, without adding in their own judgment. And so Staunton, in his attempt to do that, gets shot down by the reviewers. So I'm going to stop there so we have time for question and answer. So I don't really have a big conclusion, but I'm very interested to hear your thoughts and comments. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, James. This was a fantastic talk. Very, very interesting. I have lots of questions. And
Okay.
of course, I would like to invite everybody to ask questions as well. Please use the chat function, chat them in, and we will read them out. Um, if I may start until we wait for other for questions to pop in. You mentioned how Sir Staunton, was trying to defend China against, while at the same time in Britain there was pretty much, you mentioned boroughs, and they were all uh, painting a picture which was not very favorable. Do we know where this came from? Why he was so positive about China? I mean, it was not easy, I guess, because everybody else was um, on the other side, so to speak.
Yeah, well, so I think actually that his experience as a 12, 13-year-old traveling to China, meeting the emperor, having the emperor, give him a present, and he was really made much of on the embassy because of the fact that he knew Chinese, which eh, on one level is quite funny because actually at this time the Chinese government forbade any Chinese from teaching foreigners Chinese. And there was actually a case of a British person who had learned Chinese and who was working for the East India Company, who was arrested and imprisoned for 2 years for knowing Chinese. But Staunton, but Staunton, as a boy, as part of this retinue for the embassy and so forth, the emperor's like, oh, so great that you know some Chinese and da, da, da. So I just think that he had a good time really on his trip to China. Whereas I think the the adult members of the expedition, I mean, especially Barrow really, he must have had a bad temperament. I think he probably hated the whole experience, and that shaped him. So I would really put it down to that, that experience in his formative years when the sense of adventure and so forth that never really left him. And he remained, I mean, he became an MP, a member of parliament. Staunton, after his father died, he retired from the company and came back to England, and he frequently spoke in favor of China in the House of Lords in later years as well.
Mhm. Thank you. So we have one new question. Any insight as to why Staunton adopted the domesticating approach to translation rather than the foreignizing approach?
I'd say it suits his purpose. So again, if so, he has this kind of, I feel he has this basically positive attitude with the Chinese. He wants the translation to give the impression that the Qing code is a good code and that the Chinese have a sense of justice and so forth. And I think he decided that if the if he did a very literal foreignizing translation of the text, that his readers would be put off, right? So by adopting this domesticating translation, he's making the code familiar and therefore easier. It's easier for the British readers to accept it. So that would be my basic feeling about that.
Hmm. Um, I'd like to get back to the fact that he studied Chinese, why I assume hardly anybody else did,
Mm.
because it was difficult and it was forbidden and for all those reasons. But did that, or do we know, or do you know whether that kind of alienated him from the other foreigners from the foreign community? Was he seen as some kind of weirdo uh, interacting with the Chinese society while everybody else kind of tried to stay away, right?
Well, so two things. So even though he knew Chinese, his interaction with the Chinese in China would have been very limited.
Mm,
Um, so the Chinese uh, were, well, it's a little bit, I mean, so the Chinese merchants who traded with the British often gave entertainments for the foreigners. So there are descriptions of banquets where, they go on for 12 hours and they have 90 courses of different types of food and da, 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 right? But I mean, that was one kind of very limited interaction with the merchants. There's well, really almost no interaction with the literati class, even for somebody like Staunton, because they just wouldn't have been interested. Um, but in terms of his relation to the other people in the East India Company, actually, he's a kind of a hero, really,
mm,
and a leader of the East India Company in China. And so Staunton, when he arrives in 1798, he's the only person who knows Chinese in the East India Company. And he then sets out to do something about that. So he is the person responsible for setting up a training program for Chinese. And so he is the teacher of, for example, Sir John Francis Davis, who again later becomes the governor of Hong Kong. And he is also the patron of some of the other people. So Robert Morrison, who arrives in Guangzhou in 1806 or 1807 or something like that, around the time of the Edward Qing case. He arrives there. He wants to be a missionary. He thinks he's going to preach to the Chinese. Arrives. It's like it's not happening. And he's kicked out, and he goes to Macau, and he's trying to figure out what to do. Staunton hears about his case, and Staunton gets him hired by the East India Company because Morrison is already learning Chinese. And then Morrison gets into the East India Company because of Staunton's patronage. And then Morrison trains an entire generation of East India Company employees in Chinese. So Staunton is really the beginning of an effort by the East India Company to have people who are
mm,
competent in Chinese because they kept running into the problem that the linguists, the British, the Chinese merchants who were the go-betweens who spoke, very limited kind of pidgin English, they were just constantly frustrated dealing with them because they felt that they could never rely on them as interpreters because they felt that they were, on the side of the Chinese. And so they were always going to be, working implicitly or explicitly in the interests of the Chinese government and again, therefore against the British. So the British wanted their own interpreters. They wanted people who knew enough Chinese that they could say, hey, that's not what I said. And so Staunton is the first one who can do that. And then it leads to a whole series of people. And the East India Company hires and sets up a fund where any junior members of the firm in Guangzhou who say they want to learn Chinese, they are excused from a certain number of hours a week of their duties so that they can attend Chinese classes taught by Morrison.
mm, mm.
So it's very much a part of what the East Indian Company is. He's not an outcast in any sense in that way.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Um, Another question on something you just said, or what you just discussed. You mentioned that in his introduction, he says the best way to understand China is to understand the laws. And then you explained how he has um, worked his interpretation into the text, into his translation. Um, and then, on the other hand, you said he had not much interaction with China. So the question actually is, did he really understand China? Difficult to say nowadays, but was that something he tried to develop, or if he stayed in that foreign circle, was he really able to understand what was going on? In other words, the law in action, did he really understand the law in action, or could he understand the law in action as a foreigner?
Oh, well, that's a good question. I mean, so as I said, with the Edward Sheen case, he's actually there in the factory while the British, while the Chinese officials are trying the case. So he does actually see a court case in action at least once. And we know that officials from the East India Company on a sort of semi-regular basis would march over to the the Yamen, the government office, to submit petitions and things like that. But they wouldn't have ever had direct access to a court proceeding unless it involved a foreigner. And even if when it involved a foreigner, they wouldn't necessarily be in the room for the whole procedure. Like, so the earlier one from the 1780s, the Lady Hughes affair, nobody from the after the man was handed over, then the trial takes place, and none of the British are present. Of course, they wouldn't have understood anyway. But and that's also true of the Terra Nova affair. In 1821, once the Terra Nova is handed over, he's taken away, and the trial happens at the Yemen. And I don't think that anybody from the American ship or the American consul, or it wasn't a consul, the American factory was present at the trial. So he relies on written documents. So besides having copies of the Qing code that he translates, he also gets his hands on well, things like the collection of um, cases that I mentioned from the Southern Song Dynasty. I mean, so there are lots of collections of works about the Chinese legal system that circulate in China, and he gets those. And so those cases that he describes in the appendices are translations from somewhere, from some Chinese source that he then presents to the readers. So his knowledge of the of the Chinese law in action is limited to textual evidence by the Chinese. He's not actually sitting in courts and observing or anything like that.
One more very brief question, because
Sure.
we are running out of time. You've been very careful not to not be judgmental, not to judge what Sir Staunton has done, but as an expert in translation, as somebody who has worked all his life probably on this kind of in this area of law, do you think it was justified what he has done? I mean, translating by adding his own thoughts, by interpreting. I mean, it's one thing to make this understandable um, to in England, but is that something that can be justified from
Mm.
the
Okay. Yeah.
viewpoint of translation studies?
So I would say that I follow the German school of translation studies that basically says that in order to answer that question, you have to look at the context. So a translation that in one context would be perfectly acceptable, and in another context might be wildly inappropriate. So if you were looking at Staunton's translation to say, is this translation going to be, is this a translation a good translation for, say, legal purposes? Then no, it's a terrible translation.
Mhm.
But is it a good translation to try to try to persuade the British public that the Chinese have a system of justice, and that all these arguments and complaints about how I mean, really, you have to read some of the descriptions of the Chinese in this period to appreciate kind of what he's fighting against. Like Barrow is he's just full of bile when he talks about the Chinese. He just, he rails on about the Chinese committing female infanticide. And, if you believe Barrow, then like every well in China is full of dead babies, dead
Mhm.
baby girls, because every woman in the village is throwing one down there every other week or something. I mean, it's just incredible. Um, so, you could say that to fight that prejudice, then yes, it's justified. I mean, and that it's an appropriate thing. Um, uh, Jones in his so when Jones does a modern translation, like I said, in 1994, and of course, as doing a retranslation, he's concerned to say, like, well, why am I bothering to retranslate it? Obviously, the thing you do is you attack the original, the previous translation to say that it's a bad translation, so we need a new one. So Jones, I say, would probably disagree with me quite sharply on this point. He said so in his introduction to his own translation. But I mean, I think again, in terms of what Staunton was trying to do, I think it was a smart move. It's too bad it didn't work, or it didn't work better than it did. I mean, because again, I really feel that by this point, public opinion in Britain had really turned quite negative in respects to China. And, you know, again, as I said, later, Staunton makes speeches in Parliament and so forth, and he tends to be dismissed. I mean, people basically say, well, you have a special soft spot for the Chinese, but we're hard-headed realists and we don't buy it.
Great. And on this note, thank you very much on behalf of everybody for such an interesting seminar. The next Greater China Legal History seminar will take place on January. The topic will be the legal regime of German colonialism in China. I hope everybody will be back. For now, it remains for me to announce the upcoming seminars here at CHK Law. We have on the 25th of November a seminar titled European Insurance Law Within the Digital Age by Professor Christina Principo and Professor Piotr Tereskiewicz. Then the next will be a seminar organized by our Center for Legal Innovation and Digital Society. The topic is the first decade of the Hong Kong Competition Ordinance, achievements, challenges, and future priorities. And we have 4 eminent speakers from academia, but also from legal practice, who will discuss what has been achieved and what has not been achieved in the last 10 years. And finally, we have a seminar which is part of our property law seminar series, Judicial Seats for Innovation, How Leadership in Courts Catalyze Blockchain Justice in Hong Kong. The co-organizer of this seminar series, Professor Steve Gallagher, will be there as a speaker, the Honorable Mr. Justice Russell Coleman, and Mr. Joshua Chu, who works at Hong Kong U Space. And again, we hope that all of you will attend. Again, many thanks to Professor André for a great talk. Thank you all for coming, and we hope to see you next time. Thank you very much, and have a
Thank
good
you.
day.